Three, two, one.
Hi, I'm Christy,
And I'm Bryce.
and this is the Earn and Invest podcast.
I remember discovering financial independence. I wanted to read every blog and listen to every podcast. Fortuitously, one day I noticed a particularly intelligent commenter on the Physician on Fire blog named Firecracker and followed her profile to a site called Millennial Revolution. It was there where I used their investment series to actually learn how to invest. It was on this fantastic blog that I functionally began my FIRE journey. 8 years later, I am still a huge fan of Millennial Revolution and the husband and wife duo behind the platform, Christy Shen and Bryce Leung. Today, I have them back on the show and I ask a provocative question that they themselves asked in a recent blog post. Is FIRE still possible in 2024? Bryce and Christy are the powerhouse couple who created the blog Millennial Revolution. They are the authors of Quit Like a Millionaire and are considered some of Canada's youngest early retirees. Bryce and Christy, welcome back to Earn and Invest. Christy, I feel like the only thing I want to say to you is, and baby makes three. Did having a baby make a huge difference in your financial independence status?
Financially, no, but mentally, yes.
Explain, please.
Most days, most days I look like I have been attacked by a flock of wild birds, and I haven't brushed my hair in a week. And and there's a lot of forgetfulness, and I just sent this picture of before having kids and after having kids to family and friends recently. And it was a picture of my living room where it's like before having kids, everything's super tidy. Like the cushions are exactly where I wanted to be. I actually had time to puff up the cushions and make it look nice. And then the after picture of after having kids, it just looks like a Tasmanian devil has gone through the living room or a tornado, because everything that is not on the floor is suddenly on the floor after 5 minutes of looking away and putting my infant down.
And for some reason, it's all covered with wet wipes and toilet paper. It's like, I didn't even know how he got to that. So it really goes after having kids. It really shows the importance of like actually automating as much of your financial stuff as possible, because it's really easy to miss stuff, right? It's really easy to like sit down, start trying to do something like I have to pay this bill, and then your kid like throws a temper tantrum, and then you have to go deal with it and you forget. So it's really important to get that stuff as automated as possible and have as little input as possible, because when you have kids, you really do need that automation.
Bryce, if I remember correctly, for you guys, it's been a long time, right? It's been over a decade since you left your jobs. Was having kids ever part of the plan way back when you first kind of discovered this financial independence, retire early world?
Not really, not initially. Initially, I wasn't thinking about that. I mean, it was always kind of like maybe one day, maybe in the future, but we were more focused on the more immediate concern, which is Christie's mental and physical health that was being kind of being ground to dust by her job. So we were mostly focused on just kind of getting out of that, and then we were going to say, you know, and then it was like maybe kids will happen later on when the dust settles, and and when we started traveling, the date for us needing to have wanting to have kids just kept getting pushed back and pushed back, because you're just because of all the fun we were having, right? And then I think it was the when we published our first book is when Christy kind of went, you know what, I think I'm finally feeling ready to do that part of the journey. And Christy, do you want to talk a bit more about what that was like for you?
Yeah, I don't think it was just the having too much fun. Like for me, it was a lot of emotional trauma and like childhood trauma that I had to get through.
I was having too much fun.
Yeah, you were having too much fun. And FIRE doesn't fix that trauma. You don't automatically become FI and then boom, all trauma done from your life and you are fixed. No, there's a lot of internal work that has to be done, and FIRE gives you the time and space. It's a tool so that you can fix all of those traumas and you can work through the relationships, and you can basically just sit and chill out in a cafe in Amsterdam and then talk to people and try to figure it out. So it wasn't until I did all that internal work that I realized, okay, maybe it makes sense to have a kid. But it was definitely a long journey to get here.
Christy, we're going to talk about whether FIRE is still possible in 2024. But what I'm hearing from you guys is, you guys have changed. You have evolved over the last decade. Has FIRE also changed, Christy? Is FIRE what it was 10 years ago?
That is a great question. I think the tools for FIRE have changed because 10 years ago when we first retired, nobody was talking about geographic arbitrage. That if you're a digital nomad, you're a weirdo fringe person that it's only a matter of time before you come back from Southeast Asia and then beg your boss to give your job back. So that the tools have definitely changed. After the pandemic, people that we never thought would be able to have a location independent job all of a sudden were able to work from home. And that opened up a lot of opportunities. And places like Thailand, which definitely did not have a digital nomad visa, was very anti-digital nomads for the longest time, now has created one. And in addition to Thailand, I think more than 20, 25, 30 countries now have digital nomad visas. So the game has changed, and there's more opportunities than ever to become financially independent, because geographic arbitrage, as we said before, is a way to fast track or have a cheat code to get to FIRE faster.
Yeah, and I was also kind of not, I wasn't sure whether the recent bout of inflation and all the rents going up and the food prices going up had really taken a hammer to FIRE, which is why I ended up doing the post that you were referencing, where I kind of went, okay, let's try to run the math, right? Like what are our costs of, I wanted to basically run a simulation and kind of saying, okay, if we were starting our journey now in 2024 with housing the way that, with rents the way that it costs now, with food how much it costs now, and if we make the exact same decisions as we did back in 2006, would it still work out? And the costs have definitely changed. Instead of I calculated that instead of $1 million, we would probably need 1.5 million, like to hit our FIRE number now. But at the same time, that as inflation has caused costs to go up, it's also caused salaries to go up. So I recently had a lunch with my former boss, and I kind of asked him, how much are you paying first year, my position, how much are you paying those guys? And he gave me a number. I earned about $80,000 when I started working. Now that number has gone up to 130. Christy, I looked at the job postings from the same company that she worked at, the same job title that she had, and then I took those salaries. It's gone up. It has gone up, but interestingly, despite the fact that food costs have gone up, general inflation has caused most things to go up about 50% since 2006. It's caused rents to go up even higher. So I estimated that rents have doubled probably since 2006 for the equivalent place. And salaries have increased, but not as much. Like I saw that that from starting salary to ending starting salaries then and now, it had increased by only 40%. So when I started doing the math, I was like, okay, we're probably going to be a little bit behind now. But when I ran my projections and I took the exact same spending decisions that I made back then and ported them up to now, I found that we would have actually been hit FIRE at around the same time, plus maybe a few months. I think it would have needed to save money for at least for maybe 3 months longer in order to get to the 1.5, but it's still possible, and that really surprised me.
Yeah, Bryce, the numbers are amazing. And what you're really talking about is buying power, right? Because we know
Yes.
that inflation has gone up. So the question is, have wages gone up to kind of meet that change in inflation? And you did it really nicely in this blog post, which I think everyone should go take a look at, where you calculate the math behind it. Before we get deeper into that, though, I want to talk about the intergenerational arguments here, because I know a lot of people have been kind of saying, oh, Gen Z is screwed. Like you hear this all the time. Gen Z is screwed. People used to say this about millennials too, right? Millennials are screwed. Then they said Gen Z is screwed. And it's interesting because they've come out with data about retirement savings. And actually what they're finding is that Gen X, especially the older Gen X, has definitely had problems, right? So Generation X, the older Gen X people who were there in the midst of the move from pensions to 401ks, when they went from defined benefit to defined contribution, that group of people has very little bit saved in their 401ks, but actually millennials and Gen Z are doing much better, because they're having automatic deposit into their 401ks. And then it's not only going into their 401ks, but then it's automatically going into funds. Yep. And so the numbers actually aren't bad. I think Gen Z and most millennials are actually doing better than the previous generations, but you wouldn't know it from the headlines.
No. The world has changed. The world changes from each generation, but as they say, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. So so we came of age in a place, like you were saying, which we had basically had to manage everything ourselves, which it can be quite daunting. Um, and and I think I was reading like a profile of Tim Walz, the vice presidential contender that's on Harris's campaign ticket. And interestingly, when he was working, he was working in the military. He did a stint in the National Guard, 25 years, I believe. Then the teachers, and then I think something else, football
Yeah,
coach or something like that.
lots of pensions. The guy had
Lots of
tons of
pensions.
pensions. Yeah.
Lots of pensions. I think he had like 3 public and privately. Like I think at this point, he has 3 pensions paying into his accounts every month, and as a result, he actually doesn't own like a single stock at all. Good for him, right? That process worked out really, really well for him. But the world has changed from that to what we had to do, which is self-manage a lot of it, and then it's going to change even more for Gen Z, because Gen Z is going to have to deal with even more workplace instability as a matter of just as a kind of like a normal thing. And for them, it seems like it's even the stability of full-time jobs is not as common anymore. And then now they're having to kind of cobble together incomes from like contracts and the gig economy stuff, and like they're having to do a lot more like multiple income streams than what we did. But like Christy alluded to earlier, the ability to travel and the ability to use geographic arbitrage to your advantage really is a tool that the Gen Z, the new generation, has that we didn't really have. My old company, despite the fact that we were a tech company, remote work was considered very weird. It was like basically like one guy in the office that was doing this remote work out of Vancouver, and that's only because they had to, like, he lived in Vancouver. They really, really, really wanted him, so they had to make all these special arrangements in order to entice him to come over to in order to hire him. And so it was like he was like the only one that was doing remote work, and you couldn't ask for it. But now, even with these jobs that are paying like entry level $130,000 at my old company, they are now it's a hybrid office, and you can choose to remote, and you can choose to be remote, and no one really bats an eye, which opens up a lot of opportunities for being able to earn money in one high cost location but live in another. So some of our friends and readers who were able to do this is, for example, had this remote job in San Francisco, and then moved down to Mexico, and then became fired that way because they were able to save so much money. And even then, that was kind of weird back then, but now I think it's going to be a lot more common. So history does change, but old strategies fall out of favor, new strategies come into play, and flexibility and the ability to change with the times really is the key to any generation's ability to succeed financially.
And aside, you'll note that Christy had to leave for baby care. So if it sounds like I'm only talking to Bryce, that's because he is fielding the questions for the moment.
Yeah, Christy will come back right now. My kid...
I'm gonna take that out too, but I just wanted it recorded in case I need it so that I can put that in there. But I'll probably take it out depending, because I can always mix and edit it to sound like she never left. Right. But
and then so let's do some of the more questions that are directed at me, and then we'll switch, because she's just feeding him. She's feeding him right now, and he's looking at me very weird.
We will figure it out. All right. On 3, 2, 1. Bryce, what you say is kind of interesting, because in a sense, existentially, it feels more difficult. We're worried about things like inflation, et cetera, but you're also bringing up the truth that there are also many more opportunities with virtual work, et cetera. So let's look at kind of the pessimism first. What do you think the biggest existential threat to FIRE is today, especially if it's maybe slightly different than it was when you started out?
I think that the housing crisis has gotten a lot worse. Inflation certainly makes people feel worse. I mean, like there's, this recent election that you guys are having has been very interesting from a economics perspective, because for all of the economic indicators that are showing that the U.S. economy is actually doing quite well under Joe Biden, people feel pretty crummy about it, because they go to the grocery store and then they see, groceries are now cost twice this X more. Damn Biden. And the thing is, they're only seeing one. It's an understandable reaction because you are seeing the negative effect, and you see the price of groceries every time you go to the grocery store, but you don't necessarily see the increase on the opposite side, which is the earning power, as often. So it's the perception that it's the perception that things are getting worse and worse and worse, but in actuality, as the math has shown, as borne out, it's not. However, that just because our decision, like our jobs and have scaled up in earning power, doesn't mean that all jobs have scaled up in earning power. Like if you were working minimum wage back then and you're working minimum wage now, depending on what state or what country you're in, minimum wage did not necessarily keep up with inflation. Yet you still need to eat. You still need to eat. You still need to have a place to. You still need to have a place to stay. So rent and groceries have increased. So it is entirely possible for your earning power to have eroded based on the type of job that you're doing and based on what sector that you're in. So, however, that's always been true. Fire has always been easier for some industries rather than others. However, what those industries are change over time.
Let's talk about inflation. You brought up a few things. One is we know that inflation in the US still did better than most other countries. So while
Yes.
it did spike, it also recovered faster. The other thing that a lot of people don't understand about inflation, and I think it's important for this discussion, is in a good economy, inflation is irreversible. In other words, once inflation happens, you can't go back. So once the price of goods increases, you don't go back to those goods being what they were 5 years ago or 2 years ago. What
Yes.
happens is the rate of inflation goes back down. So
Right.
if, for instance, inflation caused a candy bar to be $5, and then over the next few months, the cost of a candy bar fell to $2, that would be deflationary, which is
Right.
actually very toxic for an economy. So
Yeah.
this idea that we're going to go back to things costing what they cost a few years ago is just not a reality in a healthy economy.
Right. Deflationary pressures happen deflationary pressures happen with coupled with massive job losses, which are not good for anybody. And as we've seen in certain other countries that have had to wrestle with deflation, like Japan, once deflation sets in and the expectations of deflation happen, it causes people to spend even less money because they know that the apple will cost slightly less tomorrow or the day after or the day after. So they start delaying purchase decisions, and then that just makes a deflationary spiral even worse. So it's incredible. So deflation is not something that anybody should be wishing for, because it means that a whole lot of people are going to be losing their jobs, and it is incredibly difficult and expensive to dig yourself out of. Like Japan's still trying to dig themselves out of it, and that deflationary cycle started happening in like the 90s, right? So, the price of housing going back to what it was before the pandemic is nice when you think about it, but the process of actually getting there is incredibly destructive.
I want to make one other point about inflation before we talk more about real wages. The other interesting thing is if you are a fire practitioner, financial independence, retire early, then most likely you are a big fan of equities investing. And in a sense, inflation is somewhat temporized by people who have a reasonable amount of money in equities, right? So this idea that actually inflation is something that drives the stock market higher. And so if you are a part owner of some of these companies that are now charging more, yes, you pay more maybe at the cash register, but you also might make more in dividends and stock growth on the other side as an owner.
That's a really good point. And one of the really interesting things about this past period of hyperinflation, increasing stock price, increasing mortgage rates, and all that kind of bad stuff, is that when you're doing the fire thing, most of your money is in financial assets. And if it's in financial assets, you can kind of shift your money and shift your investments kind of at the drop of a hat. Like you really can just do it with like a mouse click. And it gives you the ability to find value in investment, like shift where you're investing and shift where you're putting your money to really kind of take advantage of changing economic conditions. So an example of this is that interest rates, skyrocketed from basically zero to, I think the Fed rate is about like 5%-ish right now, this kind of thing, right? If you had a variable rate mortgage and you put most of your money into the variable rate mortgage and that happened, you basically just saw your mortgage payments balloon, and there was really nothing you could do about it except for sell the house. And if you sell that house, everyone else is doing it at the same time, so you're likely going to get a much lower price for it. So the old approach of basically putting money into an illiquid asset, which is real estate, really caught a lot of people out of sorts over this past year. But when you have everything in financial assets, you can kind of go, interest rates are rising, so why don't I just take some money from, why don't I just take some money from this asset class and then move it into something, for example. So what I did was I moved my fixed income allocations from bonds, which were paying really quite a low level of interest for a really long time, into preferred shares, which are a asset class that actually increases their interest rate that they pay actually floats with prevailing interest rates. So as everyone's mortgages were getting hammered because they were floating up, the preferred shares were seeing their interest that they were paying, their dividend payments, also float up. So because they became more valuable, they also made money. So you kind of got the double whammy of both sides going up. I think right now I'm looking at that particular asset class, and it's like the best performing asset class in my portfolio. I think it's up like 15% or something like that year to date. And you really, and the reason why I was able to do that is because it takes so little time to move your money from one asset class to another when it's a financial asset, but it's really, really slow and difficult to do it if it's an illiquid asset like real estate. So the flexibility is what really kind of, I really seeing the value of that now, because I don't know what's going to happen with interest rates or inflation in the next 5 years. But when you're a FIRE practitioner, your money is movable, and you can shift how your money is invested to take advantage of conditions that are that change over time. Whereas the old way, you really can't, and you just kind of have to just live with it.
Let's look at the other side, right? So we've been talking about inflation, but the other side of the equation is real wages.
Mhm.
You found that wages did improve, certainly, since
Yep.
you guys left the workforce, but maybe not exactly to the same level that inflation increased the cost of your groceries. I imagine too that, that's really variable, right? So probably for the lower paying jobs, they probably did not keep up nearly as well as, for instance, some of the highly technical or higher paying jobs.
Yeah. Real wage growth is not even across the board. If you were minimum wage before, and minimum wage did not increase at the rate of inflation, which is really unfortunate. But that's because minimum wage is set by government rules rather than market demand, which is kind of what happened with the other things. If your groceries are getting more, if your groceries are and your rent is costs more, and you're in an in-demand high skill career, and another employer is paying X amount more to offset that, and then your current employer is not, then you're just going to quit and you're just going to leave and go to the other guy, right? But if you're kind of like a minimum wage worker, that bargaining power just isn't there. So inflation has this tendency of affecting people differently, and it is unfortunate because it affects the lower income jobs more, because they get hit with all of the downsides, but they don't necessarily get as much of the upsides at all. While higher paying, higher skilled careers do get that bounce with inflation, because they have the bargaining and the negotiating power to kind of capture to retain their their earning power. So yeah, it really does depend on what career and industry that you're in. But that's always been true. FIRE has always been easier for certain industries rather than others. But what really surprised me is that when I actually ran and did the math, most of the industries that were FIRE friendly before remain FIRE friendly, because the effects that hurt people also help them at around the same rate. Not quite equal, but close enough that it didn't make that big of a difference.
We are talking to Christy Shen and Bryce Leung of Millennial Revolution, and we are discussing a recent blog post of theirs asking the provocative question, is FIRE still possible in 2024? We're going to take a short break. I'm Doc G, and this is the Earn and Invest podcast.
Cool. Why don't we switch?
Yeah.
Why don't we switch?
Yep.
Okay, Christy. Okay, Christy's up, and then I'm going to keep feeding him.
Yep. No problem.
Okay, here you go.
Okay.
Baby fed?
Hello again.
All right, I'm going to read us back in and then I will just jump off. Any question I ask you referring to what Bryce and I just talked about, I'll lead it in so you know what we're talking about in case you missed some of it. And we'll just jump in.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. On 3, 2, 1. We are back with Bryce and Christy. They are the powerhouse couple who created the blog Millennial Revolution. They are also the authors of Quit Like a Millionaire. And we are discussing a recent blog post of theirs asking the provocative question, is FIRE still possible in 2024? Christy, Bryce, and I were just talking about inflation and people's perception of inflation under the Biden-Harris administration. It kind of begs a bigger question. How much do politics and politicians matter? So again, you guys have been looking at FIRE. You've been living this lifestyle for the last 10, 15 years. You are from Canada, so a lot of times we talk about what's happening in the American political system, but that, of course, affects Canada as well as your own politicians. Does our FIRE pathway get significantly changed by who's in power, whether that be for you in Canada or in the US?
I think it does. However, as someone who is working towards FIRE or someone who is already fired, one of the biggest strategies or biggest things that you need to be aware of when you're working on FIRE is that there's a lot of things that you can't control. It's not even just who's in power, like what happens to the stock market. You can't control that. And if you were trying to control for every factor, like politics and stock market, you can't actually become FI and you can't really be on the path because then you would never invest. And anytime that there's a market downturn, you would panic and sell everything. So the only thing that we can actually do is focus on the things that we can control. So we can't control the weather, but we can bring a raincoat. And what we can do in terms of inflation, as I alluded to before, is that the game has changed for FIRE after the pandemic in that we have geographic arbitrage as an option. Now, admittedly, not every single job you can actually use like remote work as a solution for inflation. But if you are lucky enough to have a job in which you can use that lever, that is absolutely something that would be useful. And it doesn't have to be, okay, I'm going to move to Thailand, reduce my costs. You could move to another part of the country. And then if you work online, if you work making a New York salary, but you live in, let's say, North Carolina or Virginia, for example, then all of a sudden your cost of living goes down. So we can't control politics. We can't control the stock market. All we can do is control our own expenses and how we live our lives. So
I love GR arbitrage too, because a lot of people don't realize that, yes, as you were saying, you can move to another country or move to another state, but sometimes it's as simple as moving closer to work so you can sell one of your 2 cars and maybe bike or walk. And even those forms of GR arbitrage still benefit you and allow you to spend less. You guys really staked your claim back at the beginning of all this on housing. Big part of your trajectory is you partially discovered FIRE when you realized that there was no way that you were going to benefit from trying to buy a house from keeping up with the Joneses at the time you were in the housing market way back when. Has the calculus changed at all for people in 2024? Is buying a house still a lousy quote unquote investment, or is it still slowing people down, let's say, on their path to financial independence?
I think if you live in a major metropolitan city like we did and houses were 11 to 20 times your annual salary, absolutely, it still does not make any sense to me financially. And I realized after having a kid that a lot of the times it's actually an emotional decision. People say that, okay, I did the math and it makes sense financially. That's why I'm going to buy a house. It's a forced savings plan. They say that all the time. But in reality, it is actually a very emotional decision. And now that I have a kid, I can understand much more now where that emotional decision is coming from, whereas before I couldn't quite understand it. But on the other hand, I also see that if you make an emotional decision like that, because you say, okay, my kid needs a place to settle down, it's the community, it's the schools, all that. But then if you are pushing yourself, like my coworker was, working 14-hour days, never taking a vacation, never spending time with said children that he bought the house for so that they would have a stable, secure life, be in a good neighborhood, then is it really worth it? And the only person that can decide whether it's worth it is you. I can't, my opinion is just my opinion. I can show you all the math. I can show you the data, but at the end of the day, you as the parent have to decide whether that equation is worth it. I am trading my time and health and money in order for my kids to have security, to go to a good school, but I will have much less time to spend with them. Is that equation worth it?
I would almost think that the mathematical calculus at least ends up staying the same, right? Because I could say people say, well, rents are really high right now, but mortgage rates are really high. So what happens? Mortgage rates go up, less people buy houses, then rents go up. Maybe the cost of houses goes down, maybe not. But then because you're paying at a higher mortgage rate, you end up paying more on your monthly payments anyway. So the math still would seem like it works very similar to the way it did 10, 15, 20 years ago. All of this points to the fact that in many ways the world has changed in 2024, right? We've gone through a pandemic. People are working from home now. Geo arbitrage is much more possible. On the other hand, a lot has stayed the same, that FIRE is still attainable. Even when you and Bryce did the calculations in this blog post, you found that it wouldn't take you much longer than it would have 10 years ago. Do you think financial independence feels viable to the majority of people out there? I often, when people like you and I get together, people who've been in this movement for a while, there's sometimes this lament that why hasn't this caught on more? Like, why aren't more people doing this? In what you've seen change over 10 years, do you think FIRE will continue to grow? Do you think people continue to do it? Or is it always going to be like 5% of the population and that's it?
What's interesting is that despite the fact that I have seen people say, okay, I'm totally going to get on the FIRE bandwagon, I'm totally going to do this, and then kind of lose momentum after a while, or like people feel dejected and they're like, okay, I'm never going to be able to do this. The fire has continued to burn this entire time for 10 years. There has not been interest has waned over time, but then interest has come back. During the pandemic, reporters were extremely interested in talking about fire and whether we have all failed. And during that plummet,
they were hoping we failed, weren't they? They were hoping that we failed.
Exactly. They were like, I was finally right. Yes, I can finally write this article. But no, it did not fail. The fire is still burning. It's still burning very bright. And after 10 years, we're still getting a lot of inquiries from reporters wanting to know what is the update on fire? Is this still possible? People are still as interested as they have ever been in it. And I think a big part of that is because it is the solution that is reproducible. As we said in the book, this is mathematically reproducible, and it doesn't require you to be a genius, because I am not. I went into engineering for the money, and I was not as good at it as my classmates, and I still managed to get a job. I still managed to get to FI, despite having grown up in poverty and having the scarcity mindset. It works, and I think that's why people are still interested in it. The fire has not gone out. Despite people complaining about inflation, we did the math and we showed that we still would have gotten into financial independence in about the same amount of time, even with all the cost of living increases these days compared to 10 years ago. So I don't think the fire is dying anytime soon, despite the fact that it seems very dire because it's so many people want to do it, but then they end up losing steam. And from talking to family and friends, I have realized in the beginning, they were not really interested. They were thinking like, you're doing this crazy thing. You're jumping off a cliff. Maybe 5 years down the road, you're going to come back, regret it, and beg for your job back. But now that they've seen us be retired for 10 years now, they're seeing that, okay, we're not begging for our jobs back. We're healthier than ever. We have a family now, and this still works. There's more and more family and friends who would have not considered this in a million years, actually becoming more interested in it. They're using our investment workshop. They're working on it. So they are, even if they're not working towards full financial independence, they're working towards having a sound financial base for their family so that they have more time to spend with their kids, which is totally fine. You don't have to get to full financial independence to feel the positive effects of fire. And I am seeing that over time, even though it seems like there's not enough people, and what's the point of this movement? I just see so many positive effects coming from it, and not from nagging people to become financially independent or asking them or judging them on their purchases or their expenses, but just doing it yourself and then lead by example. And then even if they take a small percentage of what you're doing and put it into their own lives, it's making a big impact.
As I think about that question that you guys both posed in your blog post, is FIRE still possible in 2024? The answer unequivocally is yes. It's definitely still possible. But it made me think a lot about, well, how has FIRE also changed? And a big change that I see, which I think is for the better, is we've lost some of the aspect of rushing to FIRE. So financial independence, retire early, I believe when you started, and certainly by the time I caught on, there was this feeling of, I've now learned this amazing secret and I need to get there as fast as possible. And the FIRE of 2024 feels different. There are people talking about lifestyle design and slow FI and coast FI. A change that really makes not just the movement feel better, but the idea of financial independence maybe more palatable. Do you think it's a kinder, gentler financial independence we talk about today compared to the one of 10 years ago?
I think the pandemic has really shifted people's focus and reset their priority. Because when you are faced with that type of situation that you've never encountered before, you're faced with your loved ones getting sick, you're faced with potentially you getting sick and dying. It kind of puts a whole perspective. And I'm sure you've seen it in your practice. People who have basically their entire outlook changed because of a health issue, because they realize that what is it all for? If you're rushing towards FI, but your health comes as an expense of that, or your mental health comes at an expense of that, does it really make sense? The pandemic has really shifted people's focus from, okay, I have to climb the corporate ladder, I have to give everything to my company and they're going to take care of me, to no, they're not going to take care of me at all. They'll just shove me in front of all these diseases and germs, and if I die, they'll just put the next person in the same position. They don't care. It made people realize what's really important to them, and that is why it is a softer, gentler FIRE. The flame is still there, but it's gentler, and I think it's better because people don't need to rush towards FI. Like I said, even if they implement a like just part of the strategy that we're doing, and to get their finances in shape, it would make a big impact in their lives, just having more time and more health, and the ability to spend time with their children.
So it is 2024. You've not only survived, but thrived the first year of your child's life. You've seen a different side of financial independence, one that you kind of understood intellectually, but now you've had to live it emotionally. As your baby grows up and becomes a toddler and eventually a teenager and all those things, do you think financial independence is going to change for you? Do you think it's going to feel different? Do you think you're going to experience it any different as you get an older child?
One thing I learned from becoming a parent is to never predict the future and just take it one day at a time, because you never know. I mean, once we started figuring out his feeding, and then all of a sudden he got older, and then something else was a problem, and now we have to figure out his sleep. And then once we figured out his sleep, then he became he became more, he wanted to exert independence, and then now there's like emotional problems that we have to deal with, and now it's like, how does discipline work? So he always changes the game to make sure that we're on the ball. So I've decided, and I've realized that it doesn't make sense to plan for the future, because I really don't know what's going to happen. I can only take it one day at a time. And that's why it does make sense to make your finances as passive as possible, and that we don't spend too much time managing our portfolio. We are invested in passive index funds, so we don't have to worry too much about it. And I'm just going to take it one day at a time. I can't make any predictions because children are completely unpredictable.
Well, Christy and Bryce, I wanted to thank you for coming on Earn and Invest today. As I think about our conversation, we started with a simple, provocative question, a question. We started with a simple, provocative question, a question which you framed a blog post about: is FIRE still possible in 2024? And I think underlying that question is, has FIRE changed? And after talking today, I feel confident in saying FIRE has not changed. And financial independence, retire early, is still very obtainable today. But what I also realize is the reason why people are good at financial independence is because they pivot. They look at the world around them, they make decisions, they monitor those decisions, and then they adjust accordingly. And if you were like that 10 years ago, then most likely you're going to be like that today. And it's not whether FIRE is attainable or not, it's whether you're willing to read the tea leaves and pivot to live the life you want to live. I want to end this episode the way I end every episode. Christy, tell me what is up next for Millennial Revolution. And if people want to contact you, what's the easiest way for them to ask you questions?
Okay, so what's up next is we just survived the first year of parenting, and we hopefully will continue to survive it. We're going to do some traveling. So we've done some traveling with our little one when he was 4 months old to Mexico, 4 and 5 months. And now we're going to be traveling with him when he's just over a year old, to Barcelona. So that's going to be a whole new experience. He seems like a complete different kid now, because before he wasn't mobile. You can just lug him around like a piece of furniture, but now he's getting into all sorts of trouble, and that's going to be a very interesting chapter in our lives, traveling now with a soon to become toddler rather than an infant. So I will write about what that's going to be like, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of learnings along the way. If you want to contact us, please go to our blog, www.millennial-revolution.com, and hit contact us. We have all our socials there and our email address, and I would love to hear from you.
And am I correct in saying that Quit Like a Millionaire will not be your last book?
Yes, we're currently working on a second book in between breastfeeding sessions and feeding our little one, and trying to not be too sleep deprived while writing it. So it is definitely, we're cooking up something in the works.
Bryce Leung and Christy Shen, thank you so much for coming on Earn and Invest today.
Thank you so much for having us.
That's a wrap. All right, I leave things running just for a few minutes to catch whatever we talk about after the show. Yeah, it's exciting stuff, right? I mean, it's funny because for you guys, a lot of people, right, you kind of get to FIRE and then not much changes. But for you guys, all sorts of things have changed. Your ability to travel, losing Bryce's dad, having a baby, like, it's funny. I shouldn't say funny. It's amazing how much life can change in ways that you didn't expect, and yet how durable financial independence is. That you can still house all these things that have happened in your life, and financial independence still forms that framework that allows you to kind of do what you want to do.
Yeah, that's a really good word for it, durable. Yeah, because I realize the cost of raising kids is very different after FI versus when you are working as a regular
Oh,
employee.
God, yes.
Yeah, because you don't have to worry about childcare, and that is a huge part of the financial equation that is no longer a problem. Another thing that I realized is that not putting him in daycare has enabled us to not be sick all the time, which I'm seeing from a lot of parents. And it has given me a greater appreciation for other parents, and especially for single parents. I have no idea how they do it. They need to get a gold medal, because I don't know how you can do this with one person. We have two people. We have the privilege of not having to work, and it's still really hard. And like you said, it's different for every kid. And some kids are going to be easier than others. And I find that he's actually a pretty easygoing kid, and it's still unpredictable. And it has taught me to not plan so much for the future, which is very hard for someone who is this A-type personality, who use that A-type personality to get to FI, to kind of let it go and say, okay, I can't predict what's going to happen because he's constantly changing. And day to day, we're just working on survival and just taking it easy and not stressing out too much. So speaking of which, Bryce is actually he's actually trying to jump off the changing table while Bryce is trying to change him. So case in point to exactly what point I'm trying to make.
I found that especially people like us who are interested in finances, we really do like this idea that we can exert control. And I think a lot of us become very control oriented, such to the point where when we don't have control, which happens in life, we feel anxiety. And then you have kids and you realize I don't have control anymore. Like there's certain things I have no control over. And in a healthy relationship and being a healthy person, it actually over time helps you relax that feeling like you have to control everything.
Yeah. Just when you were saying there's no control, my kid started crawling towards me and trying to smack the laptop out of my hand so that we couldn't have this interview anymore.
I'm like, Christy's leaning in. I see you like lean in. It's because you pulled your computer away, but I'm like, Christy really has something to say here. She's leaning into the conversation. Like, no, she's just moving it
nope,
away from the
nope,
kid.
just getting away from the kid. And he's like, control, I'll show you control. So yeah,
Who's
definitely
the star of this show? Yeah.
exactly. You can't not pay attention to me for 5 seconds. How dare you? So yeah, yes, for sure. It just really shows how little control you have, and definitely planning every single minute out is not going to work when it comes to a kid.